know, stop.
for and there's some elements that some outcomes of the legislative session that I don't necessarily have the answer. We're still working on exactly what it means. But again, I'll do my best. So starting with some just overview fast facts, there was a lot to keep track of. Like I said, there 1,229 BDRs, over 1,000 bills that were introduced, and 536 bills that were signed into law in this 2023 session. These numbers are on par with previous sessions, so it's not really unusual. The vetoes, however, were notable. The 75 vetoed bills set a record for the most vetoes in a single session. There were, I say there were 16 water resource bills. There's some different numbers, you know, depending on how you count it up. There were 16 bills that I was really tracking that either directly intersect with us, either water rights or water supply and water resources. There were a number of other bills, up to 20 or 25, that had something to do with water, maybe water quality issues or infrastructure topics. But that's my number. And of those, there's 8 that passed that I'm going to focus on next and go into some detail on each one of those. So first of all, the Division of Water Resource brought forward these 2 bills, and they both ended up passing. And for context, I know some of you know this, but I just want to, if you don't, I want to explain kind of how this works in the executive branch. Sometime in the fall, the governor's office tells the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources how many bills from that department that they can introduce, and then the department within itself takes all those ideas from the different divisions, from water resources, from DEP, state parks, state lands, forestry, the other programs, and prioritize what's most important, what's likely to pass, and then those are the bills that end up getting moved on up to the governor's office, and then it needs to be approved there to be moved forward to the legislature. So this was last fall. It was under the previous administration, and they told us just 5 bills from DCNR. That's all we want. So as it ended up, these two were both out of water resources, and those were 2 of the 5. So I go through that explanation because sometimes I hear that, you know, DWR should just bring forward this bill, or should recommend to the legislature that they do something or other, and I just want to explain that we don't necessarily have that option, or at least it's not very direct. Oh, oops, let me go back. Okay, so going back 2 years after the 2021 session, I did talk several times publicly about that the division wasn't going to bring forward substantive water policy bills in the 2023 session. In recent experience, when the division has done that, it's often been really contentious with a lot of opposition for a variety of different reasons, and it hasn't been effective. So in this past interim, we put more emphasis on working with the interim committee, with different stakeholder groups, to vet different ideas before the session on bills that were sponsored by others, with the hopes that, you know, the overall outcome for the state would be as good as it could be without too much futile effort. So these 2 really, you know, they could have been within the Government Affairs Committee as easily as the Natural Resources Committee. because although they intersect with what we do, it's not really, it doesn't have that much to do with really with the water resource itself. The first being AB 19. What this does is it recognizes the eligibility of tribal nations for two certain things that other public agencies or government already have access to. The first being channel clearance funds. And this is a program in Chapter 532 of the NRS, and it's money that's administered by DWR to provide funding to cities, I think it's cities, counties, or public subdivisions, political subdivisions, and it's to do work in navigable rivers for projects like flood conveyance or naturalized bank stabilization, things of that nature. And there's been a few cases where tribes have been interested but not eligible, and they've had to work with the local county. And so the intent of this was to include tribes as being directly eligible, and there was no real opposition to that. Secondly, it makes tribes eligible for being a state water right surveyor without the requirement of having a PE or a PLS license. And this is exactly the same provision that's allowed for employees of the federal government that are just doing work within their jurisdiction. The applicant still goes through the same process as other applicants, and like I said, they would just be limited to doing work with, in this case, within the tribal lands. Also not very contentious. And then AB 34, this did have a little bit more opposition. And so this has to do with the publications that are issued by DWR. So there's a number of things that we publish on a regular basis. Most notably our water right applications, in which we get roughly 1,000 per year. Each one of those is sent to a newspaper of general circulation, and it's where it's published for 4 consecutive weeks. And once that 4-week period is complete, the newspaper sends us an affidavit, and that, based on that final date of publication, that sets the next step of the water right process, for how long protests will be received and when we can act on that application. So for the division, what we've experienced is that it's often difficult to get that correct affidavit from the newspapers, and it tends to hold up the process. And it speaks to a bigger discussion about newspapers as a means of public communication in the modern era. Well, I don't need to talk about that. But so what we had proposed was that so we'll still send the message to the newspapers, but we don't want to have to wait for a response from the newspaper to move on to the next step, because that's holding up the process. And here's another side note that I'd like to talk about. So when the bill language is submitted and it goes through the process, then it makes it to LCD. The next step is for LCD Legal to write it up, to take the concept that you submitted, and they write it up with the intent of making it legally sound, and looking for other references and other parts of law that would need to be complementary, adjusted to, so you don't have any contradictory language and things like that. So this was an example of where what came out of LCD Legal had some pretty significant differences from what we had originally submitted. But at that point, it's in the system, and we don't get a say in adjusting the language before it goes is introduced or it becomes a BDR, and then it gets introduced. So that, for me, that was another learning experience, but it also speaks to some of my trepidation, I think, of bringing forward, complex water policy bills, because it does get, I may have my own opinions or my own perspectives, but it's a broad public process, and a lot of people get to have input on that. So anyway, back to this AB 34. So there was opposition, and it's primarily around the risk of non-noticing. Like there are a lot of people who do rely on the newspapers. In many cases, that's the only way people might know about it. We don't want to do anything that would reduce public noticing of what's happening. So the overall outcome was that basically what changed is that the requirement for 4 consecutive weeks is no longer consecutive, just needs to be 4 weeks. And maybe that sounds inconsequential, but it actually makes a difference for us on the processing side. And we'll still set the RFA date, or the end of the protest period, after the 4th date of publication, just like we do now. And then the other piece of it is that the law now says that we have to post these notices prominently on the website, and we do have that. Here's a link to our website, and it's a handy list that it's constantly updated, and it just shows all the applications for new water rights that are submitted, and you can sort it by county or by manner of use or by date, and be able to see those as they're submitted. The second part of this, or an additional part of this bill, was also removing the word Mylar and tracing linen from statute. There's a couple places where it had said, maps must be submitted on Mylar. And we took that out, and that doesn't have any immediate effect, but that is part of our larger long-term strategy of being able to submit and receive and process maps digitally. And I'll talk about that more at the end. Okay, are there any questions? I don't see any. Oh, I'm sorry, there are questions. SB 113, we'll get to it. Is there an alternative system of public notice proposed, or is that something that's going to get set up later? That was really a lot of what was discussed during the hearings. Different ideas were sending notices to the county, to the county commissioners, to publish somewhere, or to post somewhere publicly, like the library or the county commissioner's office. People talked about sort of like focus noticing to people in that area. That faces some logistical standard or challenges. I think most people really go to our website, and that was, that's where that link came from. And there was also criticism about being able to find stuff on our website. So that's another thing that we're working towards, is improving that website layout, because really it's functional for people who really know how to work it and know where to go to find things. There's a lot of information on there. It's but it's just kind of a catalog of a lot of data, and it's not very user-friendly for people who aren't used to it. Okay, Dan, I'll remember that and come back to SB 113. Okay, AB 91 is a bill that Rich DeLong sponsored regarding replacement wells on public land. So this really affects stock wells that are out there on public lands, and it only applies to replacement wells. So that's where there's an existing well it's a legal well, and say it collapses or otherwise it's not functioning anymore and needs to be re-drilled. That's what replacement refers to. It's not a change app that gets moved to a new POD. So existing law allows for replacement wells to be drilled anywhere within 300 feet of the original, the permitted point of diversion. But the way the law reads now is that land, it also has to be on land that's controlled by the same person. I don't remember exactly what the words are, but basically for private lands. And I don't know if that was inadvertent, but that's how it reads. And so that's the rules around a replacement well. It's regardless of whether it crosses a section line, or township line. And so what this does is extends that to also include public lands. And it doesn't provide any other exemptions for any rules from the public agency upon whose land they're drilling. But from a water rights standpoint, it makes that kind of streamlines that. As another side note, the bigger issue that we face with that kind of a situation is with title and being able to confirm that the applicant who wants to drill a new well is in fact the holder of the water right. So practically, that's more of an issue that we deal with commonly. AB 191. This is one that this was also introduced by Rich DeLong out of Reno, and this is a good one. It was kind of a simple bill, fixed a problem, and will save time and energy and sort of align the law with what the original intent was. So water conservation plans are required for any water supplier for municipal, industrial, or domestic uses. And this is under NRS Chapter 540 for water planning. And so the way it was written, any supplier includes, it captures a number of really small quasi-municipal permits that we're then we're required to develop this water conservation plan and put a lot of effort into it, and it wasn't very functional. And I'm talking about like gas stations was an example, or seasonal campgrounds, where you don't have year-round residents, and there was a lot of time spent both on our staff time and by the water right holders to try to figure out how they can comply with this law. And so what this does is limit this requirement to only those who serve at least 15 connections, and that will exempt something like over 100 individual sites from having to do these plans, and really be able to then for our staff, they can focus on the ones that are really meaningful. Oops, gonna go back to Madison's question on AB 91. This is for all well types, production, monitoring, etc. The answer is yes. It's replacement wells. So again, it's just any replacement well. Primarily that's stock well, but I haven't given it a lot of thought, but it doesn't distinguish that. And again, it doesn't exempt it from any other requirements. Okay. AB 220 was a bill that was developed by SNWA. This is a huge bill, it's 36 pages. The sponsor was Assemblyman Watts out of Las Vegas. And it does a lot of different things for to promote conservation within the SNWA service area. And that's what these first few bullets are. It prohibits new septic tanks within areas served by the Colorado River, promotes conversion from septic to sewer with this financial assistance. It provides this condition that if the federal delivery is cut to 270,000 acre feet per year, net usage, which is this tier 4 shortage, it would authorize the district to limit use to half an acre foot per home, which is incidentally, I think it's got to be maybe 90% of homes use less than that already. Provides further allowances for limiting consumptive use by irrigated landscaping. So these are all things in response to and in support of just recognizing the shortages on the Colorado River and planning for the future to protect their drinking water supply. Now, the last two that have a box around them are the components that really intersect with the Division of Water Resources. First being revocable rights within the Las Vegas Basin. So revocable rights are groundwater rights that can be issued just on a temporary basis until municipal water can be provided. And this is only an allowance within the Las Vegas Basin. Since the 1990s, the revocables have really only been new revocables have only been issued in limited circumstances. But the concept again is that revocables, once you can get municipal supply, then that right would go away and you have to plug the well and hook up to the system. And in reality, there's a lot of revocables out there, and they really don't go away very fast. There's limited conditions in where someone has to hook up. So the overall intent of AB 220 with regard to well drilling in the basin was, to kind of limit the issuance of new revocables, of new domestic wells, and take some more steps towards speeding up that or facilitating that process of getting revocable people who are on revocable rights hooked up to the municipal system as it was intended. And again, this is not a DWR initiative. It's all done for the sake of water resource management within the Las Vegas Basin, protecting that aquifer for the long term, and also getting more for the district, the SNWA, to get more return flow credits out of Lake Mead. But for us, this is, of all the bills that passed, this is the one that is most substantive for us to figure out exactly how to implement this as the new law says, and fairly and consistently for everybody in the basin. Our staff, especially our Southern Nevada office, gets a lot of questions or walk-ins from people that are asking questions about drilling, whether or not they can drill, what their exemptions for water right acquisition may be, and so on. And there's a real nexus here between the division, our division, with the water district, and now really with the county health department, because there's rules about sewer hookups now. And so working within this new law, it represents a substantial change. So of course, we're supportive of measures that are going to protect the aquifer. We also have a priority we also have to have the priority, I guess, of being consistent with what we tell people and be consistent with implementing the law. So there's still some aspects of this that we're sorting out, and a number of individual situations that keep popping up that we're not sure if there's a clear directive on how to handle that. Okay, and then the last item on this, on AB 220, is this emergency use for firefighting. And this was a late add, and this DWR did have a role in adding this one on in cooperation with SNWA, but this applies statewide, and basically what it does is it exempts firefighting agencies from needing a water right for emergency fire suppression. And the reason for this is that we have a number of small firefighting agencies that they have a water right permit, but if they never have a fire, they can never perfect their water right. And if they do, and they don't continue to have fires regularly, they're at risk of losing their right. And it's an example of where if they miss their paperwork deadline, their permit gets canceled, and it's just an example of where water law is kind of getting in the way of common sense policy. So this provides an exemption. It would still need a QM right kind of for their basic uses. But we're just trying to get kind of streamline that for the sake of emergency firefighting. SB 113. And this is getting back to Dan Weeks' question. All right. So this is Senator Goycochea's bill regarding critical management areas. And so it specifically only applies to basins with that designation of a critical management area under I think it's 534.110. Of which there's only one within the state now, Diamond Valley, and there aren't any current petitions or any immediate plans for designating any additional CMAs. But for the future, if there are any, the rules have now changed. This bill in part was in response to how the CMA and groundwater management plan process developed in Diamond Valley. And some concerns about whether that contradicts with the other principles of water law. So the rule is a basin can be, well, if a basin is consistently pumped in excess of the perennial yield, that it can be designated as a critical management area. And if that designation is assigned, then the local community, the local water right holders have 10 years to develop a GMP and get that approved by the state engineer. And if they don't, then the state is required to restrict pumping by priority rights. What this change to that statute now does is provide for certain exemptions or protections to some water right holders, primarily the most senior water right holders. And here's what it does. First of all, groundwater management plan must be signed by the permit or certificate holders who represent a majority of the total groundwater in the basin. That was something that was a little bit vague previously, and it was our interpretation. I think what it said was that it had to be a majority of the permit holders. So this is different now. It's if you hold a lot of water rights, you have a little bit more say. Secondly, water right holders with a priority date equal to the perennial yield who do not sign the GMP are not required to comply with the plan. So we're saying that senior rights don't necessarily have to, or senior right holders don't necessarily have to play ball. And we're using the perennial yield line as a distinction of whether or not who's required to do what. And I'll talk a little bit more at the end about that. But this is one of two places in statute where perennial yield is in statute. The other is with regard to forfeitures, but it's not, it's otherwise not a standard measure as a statutory threshold. Third, the state engineer must affirm or modify a basin's perennial yield when designating a critical management area, using the best available science. And this kind of speaks to the making sure that the perennial yield is as good as it can be. I think that's the intent there. And lastly, requires the state engineer to review an approved GMP after 10 years to determine if there has been significant progress. So if it's not working, then the state makes that determination and would have to curtail. So going back to the perennial yield thing, it's so here we've established that perennial yield is this statutorily defined divide that determines who has to abide by this plan, who has to who has to participate in the GMP. And I guess my observation there is that the perennial yield it's a guideline that everyone can use, the state uses for determining water availability based on this basin scale water budget. It's I mean, when we actually think about what if you're going to be curtailing groundwater pumping with the objective of stabilizing drawdown and protecting rights for a fewer number of people, a fewer amount of pumping that can be supported, there's a lot more than just perennial yield that needs to be considered there. So, the actual impacts of pumping in the basin and the effects of the curtailment really depend on where the pumping location is, the heterogeneity within the aquifer, what the parameters of the aquifer are, the connectivity between different sources of water or different well sites. And these are all the things that need to be considered. And so it's something, I think in a good groundwater management plan, you can incorporate that and account for it. But just my observation is that by limiting the application of a GMP and using the perennial yield as a divider, in a way, it's I think the impact would be to limit the effectiveness of a GMP as or the CMA tool as a community-driven problem to our approach to a local problem. Dan's question was my opinion. Well, that's a lot of my opinion. As far as this isn't specifically what you're asking, but oftentimes I'm asked, well, what's the next CMA going to be? And do you have plans to designate any more CMAs? And my answer is no, or only in consultation with that local community, because I think embarking on a CMA and requiring this GMP is a lot of work, as demonstrated in Diamond Valley. It has to be very specialized for that particular area. There needs to be a broad public support and sort of a common view on what the community wants to get out of this. And if those, so I would be wary to enter into a CMA, but it's still an option out there. And it's one of the tools that state water law provides for addressing overpumping and chronic water level drawdown. Okay. SB 258 provides for 3-year temporaries for renewable energy generation projects. And this one had kind of a meandering path through the legislative session. So I think you guys all know this for the most part, but so normally a change application is just for 1 year. There was another proposal that didn't pass that would have allowed for temporary change apps up to 10 years. And that didn't make it through that. And other Western states have allow for temporary change apps longer than 1 year. There's a range of that. But the outcome of this was that an applicant can apply for a change app up to 3 years for this specific purpose, and it would still need to be published. But then, it would just revert back to the base rate after the 3-year period. And I think the concept is primarily for solar energy plants. At least that's my understanding is, and it's, a solar plant is going to take a lot of water initially for the construction and establishment. But once it's up and running, it doesn't take a lot of water. So that's the kind of circumstance where that might apply. It's unusual to have a specific carve out where, an allowance like this is only for a specific type of project. And I really don't expect to see a lot of these applications, but I don't know yet. There's another similar provision that I relate this to. I put it in the same bucket. It's 533 533-0243, and that's a provision that allows for temporary conversion of agricultural water for wildlife purposes, and that can be up to 3 years. And that's something we see very, very seldom do we get an application for that. But this is kind of a similar sort of allowance. Secondly, AB 261. Oh, hang on a second. Question about SB 113 from Eli. Regarding SB 113, it's not uncommon for water right holders to own rights that are both junior and senior to the perennial yield cutoff. How will NJWR be determining who has to comply with the GMP given this reality? Okay, answer to that. I think that this is an example of when you start scratching under the surface of this perennial yield junior senior thing, you come up with all kinds of problems, and that's my opinion. But they would be able to comply. They would be optional for their senior right portion, or they would have to do participate in the plan for the junior portion. Does anyone with a senior right get an exemption under this statute? Get an exemption. They get an exemption from having to participate in the GMP. Yeah, that's the idea. And just to note that in Diamond Valley, this is Diamond Valley, that's exactly what has happened. I mean, that's exactly what the circumstance is. And it's a lot of the reason that that groundwater management plan took the shape that it did is that most of the farmers own a spectrum of different rights. And for them as a community, it made sense to do it the way they did it. But yeah, you bring up some good points. And Tammy T, will there be a new application form for the 3-year temporary change applications under SB 258? Yeah, I think we'll probably do that. We haven't done it yet, but I think that's probably a good suggestion. Because otherwise we're forcing things into another form, and yeah, we'll probably do that. Or make it clear to applicants how to, let's see, how to do that on the existing forms. Okay, the last one, AB 261. This is the last water resource bill that passed. And this one doesn't really directly have to do with us, but I wanted to include it here because it speaks to the recognition of the sort of the importance of water resource management, or the wise use of water resources in Nevada. And for that, I think it's a sign of the times, and it shows the integration of water awareness into other aspects of your economic development in the state. I have talked with well, let me say what it is. What it does is it requires GOED, Governor's Office of Economic Development, to include a statement on how to maximize the efficient use of water in economic development programs in the state plan for economic development. So it's requiring this water consciousness in economic development. It also requires Washoe and Clark County Regional Economic Development Authorities to include strategies for conserving water in their recruiting and marketing efforts. So like I said, I've talked with GOED a couple times about this and how they anticipate going forward, and just sort of offered to be of assistance if they need it, or if they want to work together on how to make this work. And I'm sure they'll be working with the counties too, and development authorities on putting this into practice. Okay, this slide summarizes a number of bills that I have just some comments on about these water bills that did not pass. Again, like I said at the beginning, some of the most substantive debate were on these bills, and it may or may not be an indicator of what we see in the next legislative session. So first, AB 387. This is the bill that came out of the interim committee addressing water conservation, or the needs for water conservation in the state. And the main takeaway from that interim committee became what the substance of this bill was, saying that the state needs to use the best available science in its decision making, and also recognize the hydrologic connectivity of surface water and groundwater. Because the way state law is currently written and in some ambiguity, the bill here is saying that needed to be clear in state law. So there was a lot of community work and stakeholder discussions and good testimony about this bill. My perspective is that these concepts are already what the state engineer is directed to do and implicit in water law. But through the process, the debate got muddied. I think it got political in a way that surprised me, but ultimately it failed. And one of the outcomes was the testimony was there was a lot of testimony that said, well, this is already what the state engineer is supposed to do, so why does this even need to be in state law? But it didn't quite make it to the willingness, or that willingness to actually put it in law. But anyway, that did not pass. Secondly, SB 176 would have created a program within the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources to buy back water rights where it would benefit the resource, or protect senior rights, or prevent conflict. And it provided some seed money to establish that program. And the concept was that this this could have been operated through the Conserve Nevada program. And which is good from my perspective, that it wouldn't be something that DWR would administer, because that would, I wouldn't want this division, which has this regulatory authority, to also have some responsibility for valuing water rights and making decisions about purchasing. So this one also had a lot of support, but did not move through. Third, SB 112 has to do with basin assessment. So as a division, we administer assessments for certain either decreed river systems or groundwater basins to help support the water management needs in those areas. And what this bill would have done is restrict the use of those funds for groundwater basins to really assure that those funds are being used to benefit those basins that pay the assessments, and put a cap on the amount that the assessments could be. And this did not pass, and in part that was due to a budget fix that I'll get to, that sort of resolved some of that concern. Next, SB 180. This would have sort of rewritten the existing statute about groundwater boards, so that a county could request that the state engineer appoint a groundwater board for any designated basin within that county. And then the state engineer would be required to establish that board. And the board would have the responsibility for providing recommendations about how to reduce overpumping in that basin, and provide that information to the state engineer. That did not pass. AB 325. This one was really specific to TCID, Turkey Carson Irrigation District, and having to do with map rules and what I'll say about this is TCID is really unusual for an irrigation district within the state, because the water rights are all owned by the individual farmers rather than by the irrigation district. So what happens is that our office spends a lot of time working with TCID to track really small changes of surface water right movements within the district. And there's been efforts in recent years to really update the mapping to support that. And that's been really good for sort of vetting or clearing up some historic errors that were in the record. But it hasn't really solved the problem of how much time it takes to process all these water right changes within the district. And from the state's perspective, once the surface water goes into the irrigation district, we're concerned about the bulk use of water and making sure that downstream users get what water is due to them. But moving surface water around within a district is not, it can't be a high priority for Division of Water Resources. It is one irrigation district that's because we're responsible for the whole state. That's what irrigation districts are for, is to be able to operate within their system. So anyway, this bill was an effort to help streamline that. It didn't pass, but it has led to some constructive or a continuation of good cooperation between us to come up with something that works effectively for the farmers. 10-year temporaries under AB 90. I already mentioned this. It was a concept that didn't move through, but the idea was to allow for temporary change apps for up to 10 years, as long as they're published. AB 313. This was a bill brought forward by Assemblywoman Peters from Reno about pit lakes, and basically the concept was that pit lakes are pit mines that are constructed below the water table would have to be backfilled upon completion of mining, and with certain exceptions where that would be a problem geochemically. This drew a lot of interest because of the concerns for environmental protection, and also for the how mining how mining operations work. But it did not pass. And then the last one I wanted to mention was SB 102, funding for county water resource plans. Each county or city is required to develop a plan and update it every 10 years. And this was proposed, proposal here from Senator Goycochea was to provide some funding to especially rural counties so that they can make the most of these plans, but that didn't pass either. So I'm checking for questions again. I don't see any. So that's all I have to say on the bills. I did want to mention that towards the end of session, there was some discussion about the potential for interim committee meetings. That from legislators, and I think that's in recognition of some of the complexity of the issues that were discussed, and to be as prepared as they can for next session. There's nothing that was formally scheduled, like in 2021, that led to AB 387. But I kind of hope that something does come out of that, because I think that would be a good move. Okay. So now I want to talk a little bit about primarily budget issues. Like I said, this was one of the most significant outcomes of the legislature. How for the Division of Water Resources, how we built our budget and the basis for the requests that we made, and working with stakeholders to understand what we see as our needs and the need for getting stakeholder support, and then ultimately the recognition in the legislature and eventual approval by the governor. There was a lot of work that went into this, and the final outcome was that was really good. It was a big boost to the division moving forward to kind of help us meet the expectations of the public on this state agency, to really fulfill our expectations again, and just support the public that relies on the work that's coming out of this office. So starting with this strategic plan, and this is a little. So I'm starting here because this was the basis for our budget request, and so this was something that we put together over the last couple of years to really communicate the needs and the priorities for the division. It's very much an outward-facing strategic plan. It goes through these specific goals for the division, talks about why that's a priority, what we're doing to get it done, and what those measures are. Briefly, it's, managing water resources required by statute to optimize beneficial use and conservation of water resources. That's clear. That's kind of our primary reason for being here. Expand and enhance our adjudication section, our dam safety programs, to meet expectations and the demands placed on a relatively small staff. To modernize our record keeping and document processing, to improve public services and preserve historic data. Increasingly, this is a need that we face, that we don't have the resources to kind of keep up. Employee development and career advancement for employee retention, for bringing on new employees, building up their talents as quickly as possible, and getting people most effective at doing this work. Establish contemporary water availability data for the state through the Water Resource Initiative. That's funded through ARPA bucks. I'll talk about that a little bit more. Update the Nevada State Water Plan, build and sustain relationships with public service. So these are, like I said, this is what in my view, this is where we need to go, and this is a document to help communicate why and how. So now to the budget. So as you know, this was the largest budget in state history for FY 24-25. It was $11.6 billion. It was a 26% increase over the previous biennium. So it made a lot of things easier. And so with a lot of stakeholder support and champions within the legislature, we were fortunate to get some of that, a chunk of that committed towards water resources. And here's a few of the highlights that came out of session. These are the legislatively approved components. First two are really the biggest, I'd say. 10 additional positions within DWR, IT positions, water rights positions, adjudication section. So it's like 3 or 4 within each of those categories. This will make a difference. It's going to take some time. We don't quite have the space yet, but we're working on it, and this will really help with our workflow capacity. Secondly, restoration of general fund dollars for basin funds used to meet 2021 budget cuts. So this goes back to SB 112 about assessments. And basically what happened in 2021, we had to take these huge cuts, and we had this temporary measure to use the discretionary basin funds to patch holes so we didn't have to lay anybody off. And always with the promise that this is a temporary fix, or this is a temporary patch. And we've seen that before, because the same thing happened in 2009 in the recession, and that temporary patch never got fixed. So there was a lot of stakeholder support and communication that we really need to have general fund dollars supporting classified staff, and not be relying on this switcheroo of dollars. And so it was a $1.3 million that went to replace that. And this fixes a lot of problems for us on the fiscal side. And I'm looking forward to communicating this to county commissioners when we regularly get invited to talk about how we use basin funds. And this is a piece of good news. So the last 3 bullets here are one shots, one-time expenses, but they're significant. The first one, the maximum probable precipitation study, that's something that is really pretty overdue. This is a design standard that's commonly used for construction of dams, spillways, other flood conveyance structures, what's the upper limit of a design that you'd have to of a flood that you'd have to be able to pass. The science that we use is from 1977. It was done kind of hastily and with a very coarse scale and not based on very much data. So this is a good opportunity to update that. Continued maintenance and repairs for South Fork Dam. Always, aging infrastructure takes a lot of investment, but actually this it's a one shot, but there's also an addition into the general fund for to support ongoing maintenance, which will really help, which means that we don't have to go back each 2 years and beg for money for dam safety. And then lastly, there was some restoration of budget shortages and kind of things that happened during the pandemic, where our budget was basically eliminated and those were restored. So that's really important for our functionality going forward. Okay. So also approved in the division's budget and supported by the 2023 legislature, but really funded through ARPA, the American Rescue Plan federal funds, were a few of the major initiatives that I mentioned in the strategic plan. And I want to just describe all those and kind of give you a status of where those are at and what it might mean for you. The first is this modernization and digitization initiative, which we've called it, which is really about preserving historical records by digitizing things, indexing them, cataloging them, being able to work within the right kind of software to be able to find stuff, share it with the public, make it publicly available, it's kind of like making our office more like an interactive public library rather than a museum. That's the way I've been thinking about it. But we have a need to be able to receive, process, and catalog documents electronically, receive payments, receive applications, maps in digital form, have people be able to access or look at their whole permit file without having to drive into Carson City and flip through the paper files. And so we're currently working on this and really trying to be smart about strategizing this and bringing staff up, us understanding what we're doing and how this is going to affect them. And there's a lot of ongoing processes that we just have to be very careful about not losing things or not having to go back and do things a second time. So we're putting a lot of thought into that. This is a multi-year process. Okay. Secondly, the Water Resource Initiative. This is really a collaboration between the USGS, the DRI, and the Division of Water Resources to update water resource science across the state and to integrate that into decision making. And another initiative with a long-term vision. It's commonly sort of well, I would say it builds on, we look back at the recon studies and the bulletins that originally established what perennial yields estimates were at the basin scale. And we rely on those so much, but those, it can often be overlooked that those were just, they're called reconnaissance studies because that's all they were. And the concept is that we need to, as we develop water and as we monitor what happens, we need to continue to update the science and our understanding of what the impacts of water resource development is, and use current methods to understand what our budgets are, so that we can support this wise resource use well into the future. We've gotten so much value out of that work that was done in the 1950s through 1970s. It's put Nevada in a really good position when, like, compared to some of the investments or the backtracking that's happening in Arizona, California, where they're spending billions of dollars on overpumping problems. We haven't gotten that. The problems that we have just aren't that severe, and I attribute that to good science and investments in science that happened 50 years ago. And so I think we have a responsibility to really look forward and keep communicating the need for updating that work. Okay. Updating the state water plan. I think that many of you are also aware of this development. There's a lot of public outreach that has been initiated and prioritized in the early phases of this. The last state water plan was from 1999. The objective here is to really have a high level, functional, helpful document that will support smart water planning. It doesn't replace any county plans or local plans, but it can be a resource and a catalyst for making good decisions. Again, there's a lot of, it's developed with a lot of stakeholder input and other experts, not just DWR staff and the public. Oops. And that is on a pretty aggressive plan. We have a great team of people who are working on that now. And it's progressing pretty rapidly. And then my last slide is, and this is, it's not a DWR thing, but it's funded by ARPA money again. It's this $100 million pot of money for water conservation, or Nevada Water Conservation and Infrastructure Initiative. So this is being administered through the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. It provides, again, $100 million for a range of potential projects. NDWR is not directing this, but we do have a role, a limited role, to assist the department with technical review of applications. There's a really pretty tight timeline to submit applications. There's guidelines for how they are evaluating potential projects on this website link at the bottom, and that's an email link that you can use. And this is all, it has a pretty tight deadline for being spent. I think it has to be all spent by July of 2026, at least by 2026. So I would encourage you to look at that. And that is the conclusion of my presentation. I don't see any open questions, but if you do have any questions, feel free to fire them off. You're muted.
Thanks for that. I was just looking for muted hand or for raised hands or just questions being typed in.
Oh yeah. Okay, David
No.
Burketta, make sure people understand that if the water conservation grant is a reimbursement grant. You might know more about that, David, than I do. But point well taken. Make sure you look closely at what the rules are around that. It's not loaned money, it's grant money. There's no matching fund requirement, but there are certain rules because it's a federal program, and that's smart to understand what you're getting into. And Claire, can we go back to goal number 5? Yes. Here. I think this is what you're referring to. Establish contemporary water availability data for the state of Nevada through the Water Resource Initiative. So this is the cooperative program with USGS and DRI and Division of Water Resources. And oops, sorry. The later slide about, oh, here we go. There's actually a workshop today among all the scientists, and so we've approved, there's some pretty detailed scopes of work. Contracts are in place, the work is ongoing. What they're doing is looking at two demonstration basins, focusing on Pine Valley and Railroad Valley, and really doing a comprehensive water budget analysis. And the idea is to do a proof of concept and really focus in on what the techniques are, what we're doing, and what the outcomes are going to be. And by completing those, by focusing the effort in those areas, we'll be able to demonstrate, here's the value, and here's what we're doing, here's what we get out of it. And to be able to use that to, support any ongoing requests for additional funding into the future, because it does take a lot of work, but it's an investment. And you're welcome.
I don't see any other questions. Nope. Okay. Adam, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing all of your information. We did have somebody who signed in with they called in with a phone number 629-0850. And just for credit purposes, we will need to figure out who this person is. So I'm going to call you in just a couple of minutes and just find out who this is so we can get your certificate of attendance over to you. So with that being said, we will send a follow-up email with a certificate of attendance and your evaluation survey. And if you could please complete that and return it to us, it would be most appreciated. Adam, thank you so very much for joining us today. And I just want to double check and make sure. Oh, Deborah Strickland says, great job. Thank you for that. I agree. Thanks so much. And if you have any questions that come up after this webinar, please feel free to email them over to me and I will forward those over to Adam. Do you have anything else, Adam?
No, just thanks for the opportunity. It's kind of funny just talking to my computer, so I hope this was helpful, and next time we'll do it in person.
All right, that's awesome. We'll look forward to it. 2025, mark your calendars. Everybody have a really great day and we will talk to you again.